Yeah, hello to you all. I welcome you warmly to the lecture of Israel and Apartheid South Africa, How Valid Are the Comparisons, which is organized by BDS Austria, the local campaign group of the worldwide BDS movement, and hosted by the Austrian Arab Community Center, part of the Society for Austrian Arab Relations. Therefore, we would like to take the opportunity to say thank you for the hosting us today, because it was not so easy, as you might have realized. I also welcome warmly all the viewers who are watching via Facebook Live from abroad. By the way, this is a public event, so we reserve the right to film this whole lecture. So if you don't want to be filmed, please avoid to look into the camera. Thank you. My name is Oliver Hashemizadeh. I'm a member of BDS Austria, and we have invited today two prominent speakers, one from abroad and one from Vienna. Farid Esack is a veteran of the struggle against South African apartheid. He is a professor in the study of Islam at the University of Johannesburg. He is also a liberation theologian. And in the 1990s, he served in the government of Nelson Mandela as a gender equity commissioner. And of course, he is also the chairperson of the board of BDS South Africa and represents, therefore, the continuity of the struggle for self-determination and anti-colonial liberation. So thank you very much, Farid Esack, for joining us today to come to Vienna and talk to us. Thank you. The second speaker is Leo Gabriel, well known in Vienna. He is an anthropologist, longtime activist and expert of Latin America, one of the promoters of the World Social Forum. He had lived in Nicaragua and was part of the Solidarity movement of Nicaragua. And today he represents and speaks as a representative of the information group Latin America. Welcome, Leo Gabriel. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get into the lecture and discussion, let me say just some few words about organizing this lecture. As you all might realized, and as BDS Austria is getting used to it, there was a big hype by the friends of and cheerleaders of the Israeli government who have tried to prevent us holding this lecture. These friends of getting the opposition have called the hotel in which the lecture originally was planned to be held. They raised political pressure on the management of the hotel, calling BDS anti-Semitic, and wrote articles in the Jerusalem Post, attacking our speaker, Farid Esack, and BDS, of course. This is perfectly normal from the view of the Israeli policy and the Hasbara. Originally, also a local so-called independent TV station was interested in filming parts of the lecture and of this event, interviewing also Farid Esack, and in opposition also some representatives of the local Zionist groups. But also this TV station was exposed to political pressure not to cover this lecture. And the local author, intellectual, and board of the member of the Center for Israel Studies has protested in a mail to the program managers of this TV station, saying that he is very concerned about the intention of this TV station to interview Farid Esack and BDS. And just keep in mind that it was also planned that some opponents or some representatives, higher representatives from the local Zionist groups should also be interviewed, and that he condemned BDS as warmongers. And, I quote, he wrote, "I am writing you to express and explain my rejection, but I do not want to be quoted with any sentence in your broadcasting." Well, this is not the broadcasting of this TV station, so I quote him. I just mentioned that because it shows clearly with what sort of methods the supporters of the Israeli occupation and the illegal settlements are working to prevent a discussion about Israel and Palestine. And by the way, to be fair, the same guy never gets tired of pointing out that he is, of course, against the occupation and he's, of course, against illegal settlements, but he wants the dialogue and the so-called peace talks like the Palestinians had in the last 20 years since Oslo, without any results, but more occupation, more settlements, and more attacks. And just a few words, as we are in Austria, and Austria is a little bit a sleepy place, I have to introduce briefly what BDS is. BDS is a non-violent movement initiated and led by the Palestinian civil society, calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel until it fulfills basic human rights and international law. Concretely, the campaign's three demands are ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab land and dismantling the wall, recognizing the fundamental right of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality under law, and respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in the UN Resolution 194. BDS, therefore, and it's important to keep this in mind, is a campaign for self-determination of the Palestinian people and stands in the tradition of anti-colonial struggles, collaboration of people of color of all over the world, such, for example, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So we are very, very happy to have a speaker here who can tell us from his own background of his own struggle against South African apartheid about the situation in Palestine and Israel. So please, Farid, start the talk. Thank you.
You all heard that it's actually many people during the course of my talk I do and then they offer me water. It's got nothing to do with my throat. It is simply a nervous condition. Like, you know, some people, their eyes go like this, or they do this with their finger. I do. Anyway, you had my first for the night. The first of very many to come. Friends, comrades, I'm not sure if we have any members of the opposition present tonight, but if you are, a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to be in Vienna. Ruth Orley, who sits right at the back, the mother of that little boy who's been carried by his father. Ruth was the first one to be in contact with me from BDS South Africa. Ja, was ist los? Lauter in etwa, okay. It will get louder. Then you will have to tell me to go softer. So, Ruth, thanks to you for initiating the invitation, and thanks to BDS in Austria for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming. It was good timing because I'm on my way to speak at the general meeting. It happens every fourth year of the World Council of the World Council of Reformed Churches in Leipzig. The conference started yesterday, in fact. So I'm here to talk to you about apartheid South Africa and Israel and the comparisons between the two. I'll first speak about the actual question of comparison and how the comparisons are there and how they may be different from each other. And then I want to move on to what is for me a far more important part of the talk, and that is to address the fundamental question about how do we look at a problem. And sometimes this is far more important than the examination of the problem itself. Can we talk about the way in which we look at a problem? I, for example, I'm a man. I've never menstruated. I've never had the monthly periods that women have. I've never been pregnant, and it's unlikely that I in my life will become pregnant. I don't foresee it happening. I've never looked at the world through the eyes of a pregnant woman. I've never looked at the world through the eyes of a menstruating woman, particularly a woman who menstruates with difficulty. Some women go through extremely difficult physical and emotional times when they menstruate. So I'm a male. Is there a way of looking at the world through the eyes of others? I mean, I don't want to waste too much time, but can you imagine if men could menstruate, how the whole world would have been different, how more considerate towards women our days would have been, our financial structures, our office hours, the cycles in which industry works, because men control the world. Okay, so the point that I want to make through this is the question of lenses. How do you look at a problem? But first I want to talk about the issue itself, and then I want to devote the second part of my talk to the question of lenses. Once we've sorted out the problem of lenses, then it is very, very easy to approach any problem and to immediately know from which side you need to look at it and which side in a conflict you need to identify with. In this comparison between apartheid, South Africa and Israel, all comparisons are always inadequate. Let's be clear about this. No comparisons are ever perfect. The second thing is that very often when this comparison between Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid is made, we are told, oh, you are devaluing, you are diminishing the importance of apartheid to black people in South Africa. And this defense of the value of apartheid to black people had always come from white people. White people defending the sacredness of this term apartheid to black people. It's kind of paternalism, it's a kind of arrogance, it's a kind of us wanting to protect these black people from a label that belongs to them. In reality, there is another logic that is at work here. They are terrified of labels that they have appropriated only for themselves and that they don't allow you to use for anybody else. So if you are using a label that they want to say is unique to one society, and you're challenging that uniqueness, somebody may come along and challenge their uniqueness. The word Holocaust, for example, it first appears in the Old Testament in relation to the mass destruction of animals. Okay? But today, nobody, the genocide of the Herero people, the millions of people that died in the Congo under the Belgian rule of King Leopold, no crime, no matter how large it is, can possibly be described as a Holocaust, because it's unique. And this uniqueness is something quite pernicious, actually, that I will touch on later again. Now, uniqueness is not our language as South Africans. It is the language of Zionism. The whole language about we are different, we will always be different, and others will always be others. It's not our language. The spirit of the oppressed is one of solidarity and generosity. In the South African liberation struggle, there was a famous slogan. The speaker would shout, "An injury to one," and the crowd would respond, "is an injury to all." This is the spirit of the oppressed. As for similarities, the first one is the obsession with the idea that the human being, that the self, is timeless, and to look at the self in essentialist terms. That this is what an Austrian is. An Austrian, throughout the century, had always been like this. For 3,000-4,000 years, this is what an Austrian was. This is what a Serb was. This is what a Turk was. And that there is something that runs into your blood about your Austrianness. Now all of you know that you can be Austrian, but there's been many invasions of the country. This country has been a part of invasions of other countries. Austria has been shaped and reshaped. Many of you may be Austrians, and you may be married to another Austrian, but the Austrian that you married to, her mother was German, or her mother was a Serb. This happens in life. People meet, and things happen when people meet, you know, like falling in love. Like, oh gosh, can I send my parents to go and approach in some other? So things happen. The whole idea that there is an essential Austrian, that there is an essential South African, that in my blood, my South Africanness is in my blood. This is absurd. Any one of you go to one of these numerous places now where you can go and have your sputum checked or your blood checked, and they'll find out, and you'll discover that possibly of all the Austrians here, there's possibly 3 or 4% Austrian blood in you. And the rest is German or Nordic. Or why don't all Austrians look like each other? Why don't all Jordanians look like each other? The reality is that conflation, intermingling, this is what is natural to the human condition. And so this obsession to classifying to this, Jew, Goyim, black, white. And of course, there are complexities to all of this also. When I speak about Jews and Palestinians, I'm not dumb about the complexities to all of this. When I speak about black and white in South Africa, I'm not ignorant of the fact that there were largely 4 groups in South Africa. I happen to come from the colored group. But my father left our family when I was 3 weeks old. Okay? And so I grew up with my mother. If I didn't grow up with my mother and I grew up with my father, I would have been Indian today. But I grew up with my mother, and so I'm colored. Because the colored people are one of the 7 subcategories, the Malay people are one of the 7 subcategories of colored people. So we had whites, we had Indians, we had coloreds, and then we had blacks. And each of these, other than the whites, had subcategories. And so there were 7 categories of colored. And in case you didn't fit into the 6 categories, the 7th category was other colored. And I can't afford to extend my talk beyond the written word. But it was so crazy that a ship stranded on the east coast of Natal. And the ship came from Zanzibar. Zanzibar is right at the equator in Africa. So you can't get any more black African than coming right from the middle of Africa, the equator. You're not brown Africans like these Moroccans. You're not brown Africans like these people right at the bottom, the Khoi and the San and the Malay people. You are black African. So these black Africans, they were stranded on the beach in Durban. The apartheid regime didn't know what to do with them because the problem was they were Muslims. And if you're Muslim, you had to be Indian or you had to be colored. You couldn't be white or you couldn't be black. And so they turned all of these black Africans into Indians. And until today, you have an Indian community, an Indian Zanzibari community, living in a colored township in Chatsworth. But this is the madness of your identifying. I want to know what your blood is. I want to know, and I can't live without, because I derive my security from a claim to I am and I'm unchanging. And in this, I also develop an obsession with turning you and defining you into a particular type. So, yes. So you do then have, we are Jews and this is a state for the Jew. There's a debate about what it is to be Jewish, but primarily the Israeli state defines a Jew as somebody whose mother is a Jew and who has not converted to another religion. Then there are, of course, debates about how can you enter the Jewish folk by conversion, but generally the only conversion that is acceptable by all is the conversion through the Orthodox Jews, not conversion through Reform Jews or the conservative Judaism. So on the one hand, then you have this communities utterly separate. The one huge problem in the case of Zionism is that there is also the notion of being an elect people. The one is just saying we are different. The other one is saying we are chosen. The implication of we are chosen is always you are frozen. And so in this chosenness by God, it becomes impossible for me to negotiate with you about our rights, because God has. And if God has spoken to you and you've had private conversations with God, and your God is a different God from my God, as human beings who live with each other, I can't talk to you. Because your sources of authority come from somewhere entirely different. Now, of course, you can invoke your source of authority inside your own home. But when you share a house with somebody else, we must have ground rules in that house. And in our day and age, the only ground rules that we have is international law and dialogical ethics. Can we talk to each other about our issues in a way that doesn't impose the ethics of the global north and the ethics of the west onto the global south, the ethics of the rich onto the poor? And this is what I mean when I speak about a dialogical ethics. And so when yourself and when your community is elevated above another community, even if you say that this is for responsibility, we are a light unto the nations. The one is to say, I'm a Christian, and Christianity is a light unto the nations. Or I'm a Muslim, and Islam is a light unto the nations. That's fine. That's just an idea. I'm a communist, and communism is a light unto, that's an idea. But when you say this ethnic group is a light unto the nations, this is really racism that is at work. It is not ideology that is at work. It is not ideals that are at work. It is racism that is at work. So I don't care whether this elevation is an accident of birth, regardless of whether this birth is seen as conferred by God or not. This essentialization of your identity is particularly evil when it is rationalized as God-given, because it eliminates the ethics from the question of virtue, and I can't have rational discourse with you. I can't have an ethical discourse with you. Now, coupled with this sense of election is the notion of victimhood in the case of both the Afrikaners and the Zionists. Many of you don't know, but formal apartheid. Now, colonialism is a complex and long history. Apartheid didn't start in 48, in the same way that although we give a date to apartheid, 48, we give a date to the Nakba in 48, but we know that there were long processes of colonization that had preceded it. Apartheid became a formality, a formal legal system in 1948. And that was the result of, in the Second World War, when many Afrikaners took up arms against the Brits on the side of the Nazis. The Afrikaners sided with the Nazis in the Second World War. And hundreds and thousands of Afrikaners were captured by the Brits and languished in concentration camps. So hundreds and thousands of Afrikaners died in the concentration camps by the Brits. And when you see the images of those Afrikaners in the concentration camps, you're really seeing exactly the same images that you saw of the Nazis, of the Jews in Germany in the Nazi concentration camps. And from this tragedy and traumatic event of suffering and oppression and genocide of the Boers, of the Afrikaners, they developed an ethic of never again. But in their commitment to never again, it was only half of what is needed to repair your soul. And if you only take the one half of never again, that is a slippery path to the annihilation and the oppression of another people. So the Boers said, never again. But their never again meant never again only to us. And in our securing our strength, we will do this on the blood and bodies and lives of the black people of South Africa. And the same happened in with the Nazis. When the Jews said never again, they did not say never again to us or to anybody else. Never again to us. And in ensuring this never again to us, it was over the lives of another people who had lived there uninterruptedly for centuries. So the victory of the Nationalist Party in 1948 was hailed as a miracle by the Nationalist Party. That was the party of apartheid, our Nazi party. It's a miracle. It was clear proof that God was watching over his folk. D.F. Malan, the incoming Prime Minister, spelt it out as follows. The history of the Afrikaner reveals a determination and a definiteness of purpose which makes one feel that Afrikanerdom is not the work of man, but a creation of God. He said, we have a divine right to be Afrikaners. Our history is the work of art, of the architect of the centuries. This kind of madness, you know. Look, in all fairness, it's not a madness peculiar to Zionism. It's not a madness peculiar to Afrikaners. How many Pakistanis aren't there? Or Germans, for that matter. You may be an atheist German, okay? But then Germany plays Spain in the World Cup, and you make sure that you pray that God gives Germany victory tonight, you know, when that match happens over the Spanish. Pakistanis recently, well, at least they won. Pakistanis had this cricket match against India. Now, when Pakistan plays India, it's like real jihad. You want to talk about jihad? There you have jihad on the cricket field. And alhamdulillah, praise be to God, you know, the Pakistanis beat the hell out of the Indians. Praise be to God. How many an athlete haven't you seen making the sign of the cross? And in all of this, what we really do, we're reducing God to a local country's mascot. God becomes the soccer mascot of the Germans or of the Spaniards or of the South Africans. So God becomes a little American waving flag, going to fight against Saddam Hussein or whoever is the latest enemy of the United States. And God is all running and cheering up on kind of either mascot or, the Americans have these cheerleaders at their basket. So God becomes, this is really the theology behind all of this. So, Gary Berger, a New Testament scholar, writes about the conversation that he had in 1990 with two teenage boys from a nearby Jewish settlement in Jerusalem, when Christian Palestinians were protesting the theft of church property by the Zionists. The boys were eager to explain their simple arguments to this tourist, and they said, "We have brought what is ours anyway, and how we did it doesn't matter," they said. I asked, "Is it not true that the Greek Orthodox Church had owned this property for 100, maybe even 1,000 years? It doesn't matter," they answered. "God gave us this country and this city, and the Jews can live anywhere. We are only taking what is ours by right. These people have no right to be in this country even." And then Gary says, the last thought intrigued me. I continued to ask them all about the rights that these 17-year-old fanatics had. No, God gave this land to Abraham, and we are his descendants. It belongs to us. Everything that happened in between simply doesn't matter. Who married who left, who came back, whether you've got any serious Jewish blood in you in the 3,000 years or so. Everything that happened in between just doesn't matter. The Palestinian Christians should just get out. And then Berger writes, the conversation struck him as rather odd, because these boys were American, and they were from New York, and they'd only been in the country for a few years. So all Afrikaner children growing up under apartheid will recall a song that even I as a child had to sing. It was a white folk song, but white people don't care if they force you to sing their songs. Die Vlaglied, and we spoke about this, die land uitgegee op gesag van die hoogste se hand. This land given to us on the authority of the Almighty. So the Bible is invoked as a deed of ownership by ideologues who don't believe in the divine authorship, because according to many of the earlier Zionists, they were avowed atheists. There is no God. So a God who doesn't really exist is nevertheless reduced to a dishonest estate agent who parcels out land to his favorite, lands without borders, clearly demarcated, as if these were registered in a 20th century title deeds office, all at a time, thousands of years ago, where national boundaries were rather unknown. In the face of this patent absurdity, self-respecting academics, otherwise critical scholars and journalists and figures play along. So is Israel an apartheid society? First of all, apartness is not unique to any society. But when you elevate apartness to dogma and ideology, and when you enforce it through the laws and its agency, then we are dealing with something that is called apartheid. And I don't care how genuine is the trauma underneath that gave birth to it. And I don't care the depth of the religious and exclusivist beliefs that underlines all of this. Apartheid is a foundation for ignorance of the other, with whom one shares a common space. But it is also the basis of denying the suffering and humiliation that the other undergoes, because you feel that you need more living space. The question for me has been, do South Africans who have lived under apartheid recognize the existence of the Palestinians as akin to theirs under apartheid? To this, The overwhelming response from South Africans have been no. It cannot really be compared to apartheid. Life under Zionism is much worse. In the words of one of the most prominent international jurists, who's a South African, John Dugard, there is an apartheid regime in the occupied territories worse than one that existed in South Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu speaks about how witnessing the conditions of the Palestinians reminded me so much of what happened to us black people in South Africa. Now, there are ways of measuring sameness and differences. And in looking at apartheid South Africa, I do want to acknowledge that I'm using heavily the work of a colleague of mine, Naim Jinnah, in summarizing this. One needs to be careful about not conflating two parts of this situation. The one is the question of Israel as a state and its internal laws and policies. The other is Israel's relationship with the so-called occupied Palestine territory. Although they both represent very different aspects of the same Israeli state and its organs. In looking at Israel as a state on its own, and some laws that govern it internally, it is evident that it itself is indeed an apartheid state. And there are significant comparisons. In looking at the role of Israel in relation to the occupied territories, it is evident that apartheid in Palestine is much worse than what it had ever been under apartheid. Internally, Israel is a state that is based on a system of exclusivity akin to apartheid in South Africa. And apartheid I define as a system of privileging and advantaging one group of people over the others on the basis of race or ethnicity. In the South African context, that privilege came because you were white. In the Israeli context, they come because you are Jewish. And Jewish is essentially race, although there's also a religious element to Jewishness. But it doesn't have to be there. I mean, as I was saying, your mother has to be a Jew for you to be a Jew. You can be an atheist and be a Jew. You can uphold the kashrut laws, and you can be anything. And because if your mother is a Jew, that settles the matter. And it became very difficult, of course, when all these Russians came into the Soviet Union, because the Russians knew nothing about Judaism. The Russians were all holding on to their crucifixes, and they demanded the right to build their Russian Orthodox churches and so on. But they had Jewish blood in them, and they needed to get to another place that could economically give them a push. And it's still creating a huge problem in Israeli society, all these Russian Jews who have no characteristics of Jewishness or Jewish culture or Jewish religion in them, but they carry Jewish blood inside them. There are two issues that I use to make the case to establish this. The one is the issue of citizenship, and the other is the question of land, and I will try to go through this as quickly as possible. The question of citizenship is crucial and central to any discussion of apartheid, and in looking at how certain groups are privileged over others. In South Africa, 75% of the population, black South Africans, were denationalized. They just lost their nationality. And their citizenship was transferred to the so-called homelands or Bantustans that were created by the apartheid state. Normally, sophisticated presenters have maps and all of these things, but I should ask you to look up the maps of the Bantustans. And then you look at just a quick look at the maps of the Bantustans, and then you look at the map of the current Palestine-Israeli divisions. And then you'll think that, oh my gosh, these Bantustans were glorious, contiguous entities that could have survived. If you look at the map of Israel-Palestine, even as defined by Oslo, It's like a child took a puzzle and just a baby, and the baby just threw all the puzzle pieces all over, and just a complete mess. And you can't possibly make a picture out of these puzzles because 90% of the puzzle pieces were thrown away, and now you're sitting with 10% of the heart. So if you look at the Palestinian map, the Palestinian-Israeli map, this is the impression that you get. And you'll see what a wonderful, quote-unquote, wonderful state the Bantustan system actually was. And the Bantustan system wasn't recognized by any of the countries inside the world except South Africa. So, in the Israeli context, 4 million Palestinians who are today entitled to citizenship in terms of the UN resolution of 1947, only 25% have been granted such citizenship. The rest have all been denationalized, like all of those blacks in South Africa were denationalized. However, unlike in South Africa, these 3 million Palestinians have been defined out of legal existence. In apartheid South Africa, we at least gave them homeland citizenship. These 3 million Palestinians, absolutely nothing for them. So then there are 2 laws that govern this question. The one is the absent property law, and it was one of those laws that deprived the Palestinians of their citizenship. So the one deprived the Palestinians of their citizenship, and the other, the law of return, gave to the Jews the right to immediately return, and on arrival they get citizenship. Illegal ethnic cleansing. Now the absent property law, let me not deal with the different categories of the absent property law, but the absent property law created a situation worse than that faced by black South Africans, and Africans in particular, because it defined 75% of the Palestinian people out of legal existence. The law of return that says any Jew who is a Jew by his mother, wherever you are, you can return. The law of return takes, now you dispossess, you say, no, stateless, no citizenship for them, no place for them, so we have land. The law of return takes advantage of this dispossession and gives Jews anywhere in the world to request and to be granted Israeli citizenship. And most Jews do not have any lineage, nasl, any lineage, birth relationship to Palestine. Now, with this new Jewish citizenship comes a number of settlement and other benefits, all at the expense of the dispossessed Palestinians. And one of the major means of dispossession was the land. One of the enduring myths that colonized South Africans share with other colonized societies is the one of an empty land. A land without a people, for a people without the land. And sometimes it's like the same with Latin America. There were no people there. Sometimes the implication of this emptiness is a denial of the physical presence of human beings when the colonists arrived, or an argument that we arrived at the same time, and at most other times it is combined with the notion that the people who were living there weren't really human beings. They looked like us, but because they didn't have our culture or our religion, they were barbarians, so they don't count. And so we speak about Christopher Columbus discovering the Americans. In this simple statement is a denial that there were human beings there when he arrived. Or Jan van Riebeeck discovering the Cape. You discover something if you're the first person to become aware of it. But there was this whole idea, it's like, we have discovered a new species of fish. So you acknowledge that we belong to a different species. So the idea of discovering actually implies that these are non-humans. They're non-us. And of course, so these people are civilizationally impaired. They are stuck in darkness, badly in need of others, and sometimes they're in need to take the light of the Gospels to them, and the Gospels go hand in hand with another objective. Oh my God, this land, it is so valuable. These stupid blacks, they don't realize the value of this land. This land can be turned into property. And land in the imagination of indigenous people, it's connected to heritage and their ancestors, and the land is sacred, and the land must be kept for future generations. And of course, white civilization knew nothing about this under capitalism. It knew nothing about this. It was only about land must be transformed into real estate. So the land question, more specifically land possessions, is a major characteristic of both apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. And blacks were dispossessed of land through a number of different land acts. In Israel, land is categorized into two broad categories: national lands and private lands. National lands are further broken down into state lands, which are owned by the Israeli state, and lands owned by the Jewish National Fund and the Development Authority lands. National lands in Israel make up 92.6% of all the land in Israel. And no Palestinian is allowed to own any part of this 92.6% of the land. And then there was one, finally, about the land, there was one other mechanism that they had to dispossess people, to de-recognize villages. And unrecognized villages were prevented from receiving any services or providing services such as water for themselves. Currently, too, the lands belonging to the Palestinian Bedouin population in Israel are still under attack by the state. Their crops are often repeatedly sprayed with toxic chemicals, lands taken over, and they are forced into dense settlements with dire consequences to the quality of their lives. Land possession and land ownership clearly display patterns of an apartheid situation where land rights are based on ethnicity. Inside the occupied territory, the situation is, of course, much worse. Clearly, the objectives are twofold in the occupied territories: to clear the land of Palestinians so that the Zionist objective of an Israeli state from the Jordan to the sea becomes a reality, and two, to destroy the identity of the Palestinian people. Such objectives did not exist in South Africa at all. One of the main reasons was that the economic reliance of the apartheid state on black labor. Ethnic cleansing of black people would be disastrous for the racist apartheid state. So whites in South Africa never had a death wish for the Palestinians. Whites never imagined a state where they would not have blacks. Israel imagines a state without any Palestinians. And we will curtail the existence of Palestinians by not giving any permits to the physical expansion of their homes. If they do physically expand their homes, we will bulldoze not only the extension, but the home itself. One other way that we will curtail their existence is, of course, by massacres and bombings and. But if we can't actually get rid of them physically, we will aesthetically get rid of them while getting rid of their land physically. So you create this huge wall in the name of security, but the wall serves two other purposes. As you create the wall, you push back the land that legally was yours. So the land goes right into Palestinian territory. but you can also finally close your eyes off to these barbarians, these non-humans, and create your own little enclave where it is only you and your own type. And so the wall serves a number of other purposes other than seemingly the one of security. So, furthermore, the treatment of the Palestinians in the occupied territories far surpasses anything that the South African apartheid state meted out to black people. The combination of regular and legalized torture, military trials, collective punishment, including curfews, closures, house demolitions, the transfer of family members of activists, it's unique in the Palestinian context. John Dugard, this legal scholar that I referred to earlier on, speaks about Israel's large-scale destruction of Palestinian homes, their leveling of agricultural lands, military incursions, targeted assassinations of Palestinians, and says that they far exceed any similar practices in apartheid South Africa. No wall was ever built to separate blacks or whites. Raymond Lowe, a Jewish journalist from South Africa, writes, "It's depressing. This is a state under military occupation, without any rights for the occupied. There was never a situation like this with apartheid. The control in the black areas were not so forceful. I don't think you can compare the two situations. Under apartheid, there was a recognition that blacks could continue to live in their lands. Here the impression is that the objective is to push the Palestinians out. With us, there were several pockets of blacks living in the heart of white neighborhoods from which they were expelled, but these were only in isolated places. There was an area in Johannesburg, Sophia Town, where blacks were living in the heart of an area inhabited by whites. They expelled all the blacks to a distance of 15 to 20 kilometers away. And even then, it was done by the police. Here it is done by settlers. I don't know if that makes a difference. With us, in the old days, there were no separate roads for blacks and whites. There were places that blacks needed a permit to enter, but these permits could be easily obtained. With us, they couldn't close off the roads to the blacks, since they were the servants in the houses of the whites. There were hours when they were forbidden to be in certain areas. But the restrictions on freedom of movement, imposed by a rigid system, enforced by hundreds of checkpoints and roadblocks, resemble, but in their severity, they go beyond apartheid's past system. And now to come to the question of lenses, how to look at the problem. First of all, do we have the capacity, and this is a very important part of the talk, and try to imagine me talking to you as an individual as you're listening to this. First is the question of recognizing evil in its own time. Just take the case of Nelson Mandela. At the last count, Nelson Mandela was sitting with more than 100 PhDs before they stopped counting. PhDs from universities across the globe. But during the years of the struggle against apartheid, many of those universities denied tenure to faculty who participated and supported the boycott of South Africa because these faculty were too political. These academics were committed to the struggle against apartheid. These universities refused to divest from South Africa. They refused to give venues to anti-apartheid meetings, to embrace and to hug goodness and freedom after it had triumphed and won in public. It makes it safe to say we are sorry to the oppressed. And we say we are sorry not because the oppressors have embraced the meaning of justice, nor because the oppressors have confronted their own complicity in that injustice, but mostly because oppressors have found ways of securing and even building upon their ill-begotten gains. And so the challenge for us is, how do we recognize evil as evil in its own time and act upon it when it is unsafe to do so? My own role in the South African liberation struggle tells me that it is an enormous privilege to actually recognize evil as evil when to participate in such a struggle is not sexy in the eyes of the world. I must act in the face of oppression, dispossession, and occupation, so that my own humanity may not be diminished by my silence when some part of the human family is being demeaned. An injury afflicted on others invariably comes back to haunt you. It isn't possible for you to tear at another person's skin and not to have your own humanity diminished in the process. So when I get angry at anti-Semitic poison, at anti-Semitic venom that is expressed against Jews, I get angry both because I fear that that poison will show itself in a manner one day that I would have to consume. But I also get angry at venom spat against Jews because I recognize how my own humanity is being diminished by all forms of racism. If they came for the Jews yesterday, then tomorrow they will come for the Muslims. The second point that I want to make is this: a word about morality and self-interest. In this never again, there is something heroic about this. I saw my mother being hurt. I saw my father being led to the gas chambers. I'm committed to my family. I will never allow these dogs to walk over us again. There is something heroic about this. But it's not necessarily moral. Even plants develop mechanisms to change their color or to develop thorns to protect their own kind from predators. All animals develop mechanisms. You can change your color, some animals, to fit in with the environment to protect your own kind. There's something heroic, something wonderful about this phenomenon, but there's nothing moral about it. All creatures develop the capacity for self-preservation. Morality is about the capacity to be moved by the interests beyond your own ethnic group, beyond your own religious community, beyond your own nation. When you view the world and its dealings with others entirely shaped by self-centeredness, whether the self-centeredness is in the name of religion, survival, security, or ethnicity, it is only a matter of time before oneself becomes a victim. Being human is about the capacity to go beyond our narrow interest and to understand how a deepening of this humanness is linked to the good of others. A question about victimhood and solidarity with the victims. Now, of course, and this, don't let anybody quibble about this. I don't care whether it was 6 million Jews who got killed in the Nazi Holocaust or whether it was 10 million Jews that got killed in the Nazi Holocaust. It was a deep shame on the blot of the entire humankind. It was a particular deep shame on the blot of Europe. And it is a shame that Europe will never be able to entirely disabuse itself of. So let's not quibble about the horrendousness and the horrificness of the Nazi Holocaust. And at the same time, we must be clear that to recognize evil as evil, but don't exploit the suffering of your people, instrumentalize it as a weapon to perpetrate oppression against somebody else. Oh, so when he was a child, he was abused by his uncle. And when sexual abuse is not handled properly, very often the victims of sexual abuse also become sexual abusers. I'm sorry if I'm going into sensitive areas for some people, but I'll move on. I've often used the analogy of an exploited and poorly paid black worker in an apartheid-era South African factory. I had to be in solidarity with the black workers. He struggles against an abusive boss, against an economic system that has reduced him to nothing more than a source of energy for the market. But suppose that same man goes home at night, even if it were to a shack, and he abuses his wife, and then I can't say I have to be in solidarity with the black worker. Now there is a relationship, there may be a relationship between his abuse of his wife and how he is humiliated and insulted during the day. He is removed of his sense of dignity, his masculinity, he is filled with a lot of anger and so on, transfers all of that and makes his wife the recipient because he can't afford to hit his boss back. He'll end up in jail and he will lose his job. So you go home, you go for the easy victim. It's like, you scold your child, and then your child goes and kicks the cat because the child can't scold you back. So the child goes and kicks the cat. I can't say at night I must stand in solidarity with the man. Oh, no. When this man abuses his wife, I must be in solidarity with his wife. So you don't speak about standing by the historical Jews. I stand by the Jews. I stand by the Palestinians. No. What socio-political role and position do these groups find themselves in today? And then I will decide whether I stand with them or don't stand with them. For now, I must be concerned about the abuse that this man is inflicting upon a woman. In my attempt to stand in solidarity with the abused woman, I will not ignore the fact that this man has been hurt in the past, nor the possibility, and really remote, I must say politically, in relation to Jews today, that possibility could again happen in future. But I'm not going to allow him to try to use his hurt as a justification for inflicting hurt upon others. And so we remain in solidarity with Jews, as we in South Africa were in solidarity with white South Africans, but only as part of a broader struggle for the liberation of the victims and for the humanization of all people. When we fail to consider the narratives of others in dealing with our own trauma, we risk creating new victims and allowing the trauma of the Jewish people to be repeated. An injury to one is an injury to all. Now, I've been to the land of Israel and Palestine many times, and I immediately experience a sense of déjà vu. Now, in some ways, all of us, as we look at things, We are the children of our histories. We look at things because we've been conditioned in certain ways. And yet, and most of us, we are struck only by our own stories and our own narratives. We choose, and this is what places some individuals on a higher moral level than others, or what we call the prophetic response, to choose to be struck by the stories of others. And the extent to which we choose to be struck by the stories of others, this is the barometer of our humanness. I have never had the privilege of seeing Jerusalem through the eyes of a devout Jew. This is the South African embassy interrupting. This is the South African embassy interrupting fellow South African. I will complain to the. I will complain to the Minister of Derko. Now, I've never had the privilege of seeing Jerusalem through the eyes of a devout Jew. And yet, I have been drawn to the Western Wall and stood there for long periods on the outer side of the courtyard in awe. I tremble at the sight of these servants of God and how they yearn to be at one with the transcendent. And at the same time, as I look in front of me, and this is perhaps an insight, comrades, about what conscious living is about. So I see these Jews in front of me. I go beyond the reason, my head, and I try to empathize with them. Devout, deeply religious people, putting their prayers, they sneak it inside the what do you call this? The slits, inside the slits of the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. Their petitions to God and so on. The yearning, it's the closest point that they can reach to God in this physical sense. And so I observe as a scientist, but as a religious person, I also empathize. But there are two other dimensions to who I am. I am an historical being, I have a history, and I am a liberation theologian. So I look back into my history, and I recognize that despite the Muslim protestations of the universality of Islam and guarantees of religious tolerance to religious minorities, I never lost my awareness that this was also a city that saw an earlier ethnic cleansing from 1948 to 1967, when the Jordanians had expelled all Jews from the Jewish quarters, and all Israelis of all religions were banned from visiting East Jerusalem. And Jews were denied access to the Western Wall and the Mount Olives, amongst other sites. So I look there, and I look at my own hands, and I realize that my own hands aren't clean. My own hands as a Muslim. But I'm not trapped just in the guilt of the past, because it's also about what do I do now? And then I look to the right, and I choose to see the women at the edges of the wall. On the far right, divided by the Mechitza, and their legal struggle since 1988 to secure the right to pray at the prayer wall wearing a talit, the prayer shawl, praying out aloud and reading from the Torah. And I wonder about these women activists. Have any of them seen the connection between their struggle for space in a man's world, where maleness must mean control and possession of the center on the one hand, and on the other, that of the Palestinians in a world where dispossession and displacement of non-us ethnic or religious groups is inherently tied to this vision of usness. They are so holy, they are so desperate for God that they don't see the women. We particularly don't have to see the Palestinians. My last section, I have a half a page, a little bit more than half a page to go. The question of indifference or moderation. And there are many people who opt for this path. I don't take sides. There must be dialogue. There must be conversation. If only they can live in peace. When we reduce the problem to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or worse, the Israeli-Arab conflict, or we speak about the Middle Eastern situation, what does it really say about us and our power interests and our refusal to have our own comfort zones disturbed? When we say, when a man beats up his wife and you say, oh, there's a domestic dispute, they have marital issues, this is deeply insulting to the women involved. When you describe the abuse against women as domestic issue or a domestic dispute, what you have really done, you have taken the side of this abusive man. Oh, I don't want to get involved in their issues. Why? Oh, you're a business partner of the man. That's why you refuse to recognize the blue marks on the woman's face. And you buy every time into her stories that she knocked into the door, she knocked into the wall, she fell. You know exactly what's going on. But you are in a serious business relationship with a husband, and so you can't raise any of these awkward questions. I don't want to get into the middle of this. I say that it is really what prevents you and what gets you into the lie of both sides have a story to tell, let's have dialogue. The basic thing is your own interest. Your interest of class, of race, your common European heritage, your civilizational values, and your economic interest. It is this that is served by your defensiveness, by your refusal to connect the dots, and by your inability to speak once you have connected the dots. I'm astonished, I'm drawing to a close now. I'm astonished at how ordinary, decent people, you know, in Graz, there were people who were comrades of many of the immigrant people who are also in the solidarity movement, anti-xenophobia, in favor of there's some construction there that the local communities are all against. They progressive on everything except Palestine. They call peeps, progressive on everything except Palestine. And suddenly now with my coming there, a number of those good people said, oh, we're sorry. On this, we don't agree with you. Farid Esack speaking in Graz, this is not on. So we're with you on everything else, but not on this. It's amazing. Ordinary people, decent people, their hearts are in the right place. When it comes to Israel and Palestine and the dispossession and suffering of the Palestinians, then it's a different thing. And I wonder about the nature of decency, of objectivity, of moderations, both sides. Is moderation in matters of manifest, clear injustice really a virtue? Do both parties deserve an equal hearing in a situation of domestic violence? Where a woman gets beaten up by a male who was abused by his father some time ago because the victim too, because the victimizer himself was a victim. Why must someone else suffer because the husband was abused by some other male yesterday? Whose story are we really being tuned into? And whose interest do we serve by tuning into the side that we do, by opting for a false neutrality? When I walk through the districts where sex is on sale, whether it is St. Pauli in Hamburg or the Waale in Amsterdam, I can choose to see what I see through the eyes of the sex tourist, or I can see it through the eyes of the sex worker who is sold into the trade and driven there by poverty and exploitation. I choose to look at Palestine, Israel, through the eyes of the marginalized and the exploited. And I choose to privilege this perspective over other perspectives. So is it sex tourism or sexual exploitation? Or worse, is it a refusal to name it and a preference to speak about, well, I'm just going to have some fun, or I'm just going to St. Pauli. All of you know St. Pauli in Hamburg, or about it at least, or you've heard about it. No? Oh, there are some babies in the audience who've never heard about it, but that's understandable. Worse, you describe your visits to those areas as mere relaxation. It depends entirely on where you are located in the power structure. And so you Austrians must ask, where in the power structure in Austria, where in the power structure in Europe are you located in your looking at the sex district? So you can go and watch the beaches. Do the Israelis have a beach in Vienna?
Tel Aviv Beach.
You can go to Tel Aviv Beach and you can see, hey, this is a real sex bomb, man. I must get some of this, you know. I must get some of this. Yeah, you can do that if you want to. Where do you come from? Through what lenses do you see do you choose to see what we see? We are in the middle of this, friends, because we do business with the abused husband. And we profit from his abuse of his wife. We sustain Israel's illusions that it is okay, a part of the civilized crowd. We seek refuge in both sides have a story to tell as a way of dodging our own complicity. Instead of merely hallowing the abuser with a mantle of respectability, our silence draws us into a web of complicity. In conclusion, I want to say this. However small a minority they may have been, only those who refuse to turn a blind eye to the persecution of the Jews by the Nazis and who refuse to be silent, only they were civilized. All the others had Jewish blood on their hands. Talking about the German-Jewish conflict or the black-white situation or marital issues, in the face of clear injustice and domestic abuse, it is no great virtue. It is the path of, in the beginning, acquiescence and ultimately complicity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Farid Esack. I think we should start with the comparison between the democratic and anti-colonial struggle in Latin America. Short briefing by Leo Gabriel. So, without further delay, I give it to Gabriel.
Don't be afraid. I won't be long. Only. Congratulating my neighbor for this brilliant analysis, of which, of course, in nearly every country of the world you can make parallel structure, but I find the basic idea to see the reality through the eyes of the other, sort of an anthropological approach. So wonderful. Thank you for being here, and also in the name of the Latin American group, where we are dealing with problems which are apparently very different, but sometimes very much similar. Our last edition is on the war between United States and Mexico, and there is a struggle going on against this war, as you can imagine, on the Mexican side. In order not to repeat for Latin America what has been made as a comparison with Africa, I want to only highlight 3 or 4 points answering to the question which I wanted to ask you, as a matter of fact. What is the way out? Because you gave an analytical framework of things like so important, like Frantz Fanon's idea that the imagery of the oppressed can become very many times the imagery of a new oppressor. What is the discussion in Latin America? How do you break through this Gordian knot where everything seems to repeat itself? And I think the one most important discussion was to break with the unity coming from European side between and identity between nation and state. I think whatever happened after the French Revolution had this original sin in it to identify power, nation, and state in one, be it now in a representative democratic system or other systems, but this has been the achievement of these last 2 centuries, that you always see that the nation is bound to the state. And in front of that, the oppressed people, not only the indigenous people, but also the indigenous people, the oppressed people and the oppressed peoples of Latin America, they initiated a process which did not strive for taking over the power of the nation state, but to restructure society, to make a new social contract where the individual is not the citizen, is not the only actor, but that the community and the cultural identity of sorts puts together an identity which then serves as a player of mass movements. Mass movements from the one side and from the other side. If you can say from the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, to have another reference point which is not the one inherited by nationalism, which is not inherited even not by representative democracy in the way we have it also here in Europe, but to discover new forms of democracy which takes for granted the diversity, the unity in diversity. This is the big slogan of the indigenous movement in Latin America, in order to achieve liberation. Is there a possibility that this kind of knowledge, out of which grew finally also the Latin American theology of liberation, this can be applied to the conflict Israel-Palestine? Is it possible within a new setting and how this setting should look like. In Latin America, for instance, you have since about not very long, the last 10 years, developing a doctrine called the New Latin American Constitutionalism, which gives another perspective on the law. You know, the oppressors are always making reference to the law they themselves have constructed. And they say, you are illegal. With what power, with what identity? No, the law is not something which is written in stone. The law is something which has to be discussed by the people from bottom up. I think that many of these ideas, which finally have led us to overcome the basic structure of nation states, where you have really the nations, the peoples of different kinds, as an actor within a framework which you call a state, but which is only observing the rules of the actors, collective actors, individual actors within this framework. I'm just coming now from Mexico, and I can tell you that this process is now in a situation where really, unlike never it has been before, the situation is so bad, with the drug lords together with the government, the United States. They say they will combat this, but they are supporting this, and they are building walls and everything like that. But there is hope of a major breakthrough, not to repeat the mistakes which in other countries have been made, like for instance in Venezuela and other countries. There were mistakes, there are mistakes being made. But in order to find a new perspective on history, and that I found so wonderful in your analysis, that you brought back the questions to the roots. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leo Gabriel. Looking at the watch, I think we should open the question. I asked Farid, we want to make just 2 rounds with 3 questions, so 6 questions from the audience. I'm so sorry, but we have interviews later, so we have not so much time. So perhaps if there are questions, okay, one question, this gentleman here.
Can the person say who is she?
Yeah. Could you please introduce yourself and say which organization, or if not organization, your name, what your background? Okay.
My name is Mohammed. I am Austrian-born Egyptian. I was recently in Israel and Palestine, like 4 weeks ago, before the start of Ramadan. First time in my life. And but my question refers to your first sentences, actually, where you were saying, like, when, for example, you're talking about when white people are talking about apartheid and saying that it is more or less bad, or more or less saying that how people are actually, or how people are actually treated, and saying this is apartheid and this shouldn't be done. You are saying that it comes from an arrogant and presumptuous perspective, and because it is not their fight, it's not, because they are actually the oppressors. So what I wanted to ask is,
Okay, Mohammed. Before you continue your question, the assumption of your question is actually a faulty one. I said that there are many Israelis or apologists for the Israeli regime, typically white, who say, no, you can't compare the conditions in Israel to apartheid, because to do so is an insult to those black South Africans. That was the first thing that I said. And then I said that this is ridiculous. Who are these white people to suddenly come to the defense of these black people, as if black people can't define and elaborate on their suffering themselves? That was the point that I was making.
I understand this.
Okay.
Yeah, I acknowledge that, but I don't understand that you are saying how can white people why should white people try to explain the apartheid? I completely understand that they are using it, they are instrumentalizing it, this claim saying how can you actually take this into perspective, or how can you look at this and say Israel is an apartheid state? And I completely understand that, but I do not understand why are white people not allowed. It's not about whether white people are allowed or not to say, oh, this is apartheid. But it is about white people saying, let me tell you what apartheid was. Don't listen to these black people. This is white arrogance. This is white privilege. When black South Africans, and with one exception, a Christian right-wing fundamentalist, the Reverend Kenneth Meshwe, whose political party has 2 seats in Parliament of 400. With one exception, Kenneth Meshwe is the only black South African who have said that this is not comparable to apartheid. All the other black leaders who have been to South Africa says this is apartheid. And then these white Jews want to come and tell us this is not apartheid. In this context, I'm saying that the whites, and only in this context, I'm saying that those whites have no business telling us what apartheid was. In that context.
Other questions? Please, yeah.
Yes. I actually now Gary Happiness from Austria. My question is, what do you think will the impact of the Qatar crisis on West Bank, Gaza, and generally on the BDS movement?
Okay, I didn't see this question coming. It depends on how it unfolds. And it is a bit unclear on how the Qatar crisis is going to unfold. I am desperate for it to not unfold in favor of the Saudi Emirates crowd. If it unfolds in favor of the Saudi Emirates crowd, it is quite clear that the Palestinian struggle will receive a major setback. There is a strong alliance that's been going on for a long time already between a number of the Arab states and Israel. But there has been a general sense of embarrassment about it. It's like, I do visit sex workers, but I don't tell my friends that I visit sex workers. I keep quiet about it. People, by the way, I'm not into sex workers, okay? It is just an analogy. Some of you may be thinking, hey, this guy's talking too much about it. What's going on here? Where there's smoke, there must be a fire. It's just a very interesting analogy. And I also know that most people, once they start falling asleep, they suddenly wake up as soon as they talk about sex. So it's just a device that I use. So it's like, you visit sex workers, but it's not a decent thing to be doing, so you do it quietly. And now they are going very openly about it. إِذَا فَاتَكَ الْحَيَاةِ فَفْعَلْتَ مَا شِئْتَ. When modesty goes out by the window, then you do just what you want to do and where you want to do it. And so this is what is happening now, and this has been facilitated by the coming to power of another shameless entity, the President of the United States of America. And again, the analogy is appropriate. The United States has always played this role, but in the quiet of the night and more gently and so on. Now it is doing all that it does in a very brazen and public way with the coming of Trump into the White House. And so it's really bad news. It's really, really bad news for the Palestinians. They've made the argument that it is about Hamas and that it is about Hezbollah. It's not about Hamas. It's not about Hezbollah. It is about strengthening the United States' control in that part of the world. The United States in general has a solid hold over Israel, and Israel, of course, has a solid hold over the United States on the other hand. And now it is about consolidating the United States' influence in that part of the world. And a necessary part of consolidating that influence is the ending of what they call the Palestinian conflict. And by their terms of ending the Palestinian conflict, it is the smashing of all forms of resistance to the Palestinians. And the internal forms of resistance, whether you like the form of resistance or not, has been primarily led by Hezbollah and by Hamas. And I'm not asking you to agree with all their tactics. Some of you supported the African National Congress, but you didn't support the armed struggle. But you remained supportive of the people of South Africa. Okay? The Swedes, by the way, and the other Nordic countries, they also gave money for weapons. Germany on the whole, the population, Germany and Austria, the population supported the South African these things, and we had strong ANC branches in this parts of the world, but not the governments of these countries for a brief period in Germany, under Willy Brandt. But anyway, I'm not going into that now. So I see the consequences as very dire for the Palestinians if the Qataris in the end lose. I don't think that the other Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, primarily Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, I don't think that they had anticipated the support of Turkey and Iran into this dynamic, and that has messed up things a good bit for them. There is sufficient wealth in Qatar, and it doesn't mean that I'm a great fan of Qatar also, okay? But relative to other Arab countries, Qatar did have a vibrant BDS movement. Qatar did have a relatively free press, but it wasn't free enough to criticize Qatar itself. That's also this, but again, people don't have to be perfect to be having your support. It depends on which. And so if the, I'm hoping, and it's still a bit of a long answer, but Salman, the new the crown prince, he looks like a bit of a vain idiot. He's a junior and younger and a bit of a better looking version of Donald Trump. but hopefully he blunders his way fairly rapidly into destruction and oblivion. The only regrettable part is how many other people in the region will he take down before he goes down.
Paula, please.
My name is Paula Abram-Surani. I'm with Women in Black in Vienna. We're an activist group for Palestine. What you experienced in Graz, I think, is the result of the fact that any discussion of what's really happening in Palestine, in the occupation, is denied to the population here. Unless people come to events like this or pass by our vigils on the street, most people have no idea of what's going on there. They don't know about the children who are being arrested every day and beaten and tortured. They don't know what's going on because the media does not allow them to know. And we are all experiencing a boycott of what we are doing, that we cannot even find a room, which I would say in Germany is not impossible. But in Austria it's becoming impossible to open your mouth about anything. And I'm very worried that what you experienced in Graz with this opinion is a result of the fact of real ignorance. Maybe people don't want to know, but they're not even allowed to know what's going on. And I'm worried about the future because I think there is a big pressure to stop protests. And I wonder what you think we can do if it comes to this, if we're not allowed to be on the street by the government. How can we fight against this?
Yeah, look, it's a difficult one for me. I need to understand. I mean, I spent 3 months in Germany, November, December, and January. And I also traveled around the country for both Islamic studies stuff and BDS stuff. And I don't know if my encounters in Austria is significantly different from my encounters inside Germany. I do think that in Europe, on the whole, partly Europe's own creation, its participation in foreign military adventures and so on, and then having those chickens coming home to roost. I mean, people aren't taps that you turn on and off like this, you know. You encourage a jihadi Islam against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and then the next day the Soviets are defeated and the Soviet Union collapse, and all this jihadi Islam that you encourage, you suddenly now want it to die, and now you want a moderate Muslim who's like a good moderate Muslim is one who lies on the ground pretending to be dead, and then you can walk over him. So the one day you want a Kalashnikov carrying a jihadi Muslim, you fund him, you support him. They have offices all over Europe and the United States when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. And then the next moment, gosh, you know, or must finish all of this jihadi Islam. Now we want the good Muslims, you know. And now, you know, Iran becomes a bad country, Syria becomes a bad country, And the good guys are the guys who don't allow women to drive cars, let alone drive their own lives. The Saudis, they become the good guys because they are in your pocket. And then you're sitting now with the problem of ISIS, the jihadification or the militarization of Islam on the one hand, and the alienation that many immigrants feel, partly as a consequence of the racism in this society, only partly, but also partly of how in some sectors of the Muslims, for some Muslims, Islam had been militarized in a romantic, extremely negative and dangerous way. And Islam is only this ISIS for some of these alienated young people. Just by the way, and slightly off the point, you know, I think yesterday there was an attempt to crash into a mosque in Paris. And whenever any of these things happen, my first impression is, oh my God, what a deranged individual. What a troubled individual. Whenever any of these things happen. And the sad thing is, but in the Western media, when any of these things happen, and it's against Muslims, then we think it's a deranged individual. But when it is a Muslim, then it is a Muslim. It's not a deranged. Of course, it's an equally deranged individual. It's an equally crazy individual. Sad, broken, pathetic, psychologically disturbed. But then we say, no, he's a Muslim. And all of this, unfortunately, is also leading to a security crisis in Europe. And in the midst of the security crisis, there are two things. One is a genuine security concern, and the other one is now is also the time for us to turn the screws onto these Muslims that we have always been uncomfortable with in any case. Their culture threatens us. I just can't stand your head scarf. Gosh, how do you, in the middle of the summer, walk around with this head scarf? Your head scarf really riles me. I'm pissed off about your head scarf. Do you know how many times haven't my heart gone out to people at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock at night in the streets of Berlin, of Amsterdam or Holland? These women in the middle of winter walking with their with their small short skirts. My heart goes out to them, to these women. They walk on these high-heeled shoes on the cobbled streets, and they're going to fall any minute. And I think about the damage that it's causing to their back. And it's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. They're all walking around with their shoes in their hands. They were in pain all the time when they were walking in their shoes. I never thought of going up to them and pulling their shoes off from them and say, I will liberate your shoes from these tight-fitting shoes, How? So what's your story? That the headscarf of somebody else upsets you and riles you. Something is wrong with you. I have a reason to liberate your foot from your shoe. For the sake of your shoe, it is unhealthy, my darling. It's your back. It's going to injure you. The point that I'm trying to make is this. There has been, I'd like to know what that joke was at the back. The point that I'm trying to make is this. There has been a residual kind of resentment about others. And part of this resentment comes from a European arrogance. We are the heart of civilization. This is where the republic, this is the basis of democracy, the basis of civilization, arts and history and music and so there's been a deep, and so this European arrogance finds all of this other kinds of holding on to as manifestations of barbarism. And these things are all conflating now to lead to a security problem. And now we want to curb. We want to curb gatherings, we want to curb meetings, we want to curb protests in the name of security, but underneath all of this is the protection of our civilization. And so it is going to increase. There have been some good signs though. Yesterday, a woman from the CIA arrived in Italy to serve a 3-year jail sentence from the United States, to serve a 3-year jail sentence for her role in the rendition of an Egyptian person that was kidnapped in Italy with her assistance and then sent off to Egypt to be tortured there. So I think at some levels there are international instruments that are still at work. The international, the International Human Rights Commission based in Geneva. There's also the European Court of Justice that has given relatively progressive judgments on a few of these things. But I do think that the space for civil liberties is being diminished. I haven't answered your question about what can be done. I think that other Europeans like yourself who are concerned about this must meet with other people committed to the preservation of civil liberties and so on, and to examine how do you respond to all of this at a social movement level, at a legal level, and that there needs to be far more vigilance, the kind of vigilance that you're beginning to see emerging in the United States in the wake of all these immigrant or migrant bannings. Not much of an answer, Dolly? Yes, Paula. Not much of an answer, Paula, but...
I'm very worried. I'm very worried about this because it seems that the only country you cannot criticize here in Europe is Israel, which deserves so much criticism. And this is appalling, considering what's going on. But I just wanted to say one thing. I meant to say at the very beginning how fascinated I was with your talk. It was one of the finest talks I've heard. Thank you so much, BDS, for bringing Mr. Esack here. And I really appreciated being able to listen to you.
But we are not finished now, so...
I wanted to say that.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps two questions? Two last questions? Okay, yeah, please.
You from?
Antifaschistische Aktion from Kuka. We are also newspaper on the info table. My question is, how does the movement today looks like against the Apartheid and against the citizens generally?
Yes.
The second question is, I hear many times Afrikaans is a language which is like a mix of German and Dutch or English, and other language and what for languages was there before the colonization?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. What was the first question?
The original language.
No, that was the second question.
The first was about the...
Was war nochmal die erste Frage? Entschuldigung.
Okay, danke. Yeah, okay. The BDS movement is 11 years old. The anti-apartheid movement, the Boycott South Africa movement, was 23 years old before it scored its major victories. It was a similar kind of situation in European countries, where it was really very low-key and small in the beginning, and it later took off. The BDS movement, of course, is sitting with a much bigger problem. And the one problem is, the big problem is European complicity and white guilt. White guilt and European complicity. And so when you touched white South Africa, 300 years had passed already, and the whites in the Netherlands, the Dutch people, they had felt embarrassed and ashamed about those barbaric Boers in South Africa. So the Dutch people on the whole were quite sympathetic, and most Europeans, populations, not governments, were sympathetic often to the South African cause. In the case of Palestine, Israel is too central to the geopolitical interests of the West for it to abandon. So Israel is a strong ally of the West. And so to the extent that the West remains very powerful, bear in mind that at the time of the apartheid era, there were two competing poles of power, the Soviet bloc and the NATO bloc. So now there is only one, and so the opponent that we're facing is much more solid and much more on surer grounds. However, BDS in the last 11 years has seemed, now the one is successes that it has logged up. But the other way of looking at it is, would Israel have become even a stronger state economically if BDS wasn't around? And we have succeeded to a large extent in many parts of the world, certainly from Latin America, and until the last year or two, and these are successes that have been reversed, until the last year or two also in Africa, although the Israelis are now making lots of gains in Africa. The fact that the Israeli government recognizes BDS as the biggest existential threat to what they say Israel, and we say to Zionism, and has invested millions of rands and created a special ministry to deal with BDS in the last year or so. It is, in fact, a reflection of the strength and the successes that BDS has had. They've never paid as much attention to us as they have now. There have, for example, been BDS types of activity in Vienna before. And some of the BDS comrades tell me, that this is the first time that there has been this level of mobilization against an event. The first time that there's been this level of mobilization against an event. And partly it is because of all the funding that is now being given to these different Israeli activist or propaganda Hasbara units. So in some ways, yes, there has been a number of victories for BDS internationally, certainly more victories than what the anti-apartheid movement had chalked up at the same time, at the comparable time in its history. But the one huge headache for BDS is that every victory that we achieve creates more work and more headaches for ourselves. Because the Israelis become more determined, they throw much more money into things, and so we are creating more and more work for ourselves all the time. And this is, I must admit, it is a bit of a dilemma. As for your second question, Afrikaans is primarily derived from, the major influence in Afrikaans is Dutch. Afrikaans is one of those Germanic languages, and there has been no consequential influence between Afrikaans and the indigenous languages of South Africa. There is no consequential influence from the top of my head, I can't think of a single word in Afrikaans from the indigenous languages. It's also interesting, it shows also kind of the power, that the colonists have. Others must learn our language. But there is a significant Malay-Indonesian influence in the Afrikaans language. And that is because of the because of the slave population that were brought, the slave and the political exiles who were brought by the Dutch into to the Cape. And so there's a very strong Malay influence in Afrikaans. In fact, the first books in Afrikaans was written with an Arabic text. So Arabic was the first language where Afrikaans was written. Because many of the people who spoke Afrikaans were Muslim religious scholars. And so the first books in Afrikaans that were written in an Arabic text.
Okay, Joseph and then Willy, and then we should come to an end. Willy, Joseph, please.
Thank you for speaking on the question of lenses.
Perhaps now, just a short introduction of your person.
I have a long history of...
Willy Brand?
No,
9, okay.
No, of 55 years in Southern Africa, and with churches. And now you're going to the World Council of Reformed Churches. The World Council of Churches had suspended the membership of the Niederdeutsche Reformed Church during apartheid time. Now, as Paula also said, the pressure is growing. Even I'm asking you, is there a new Christian Zionism coming up? And what will you do to the Reformed churches?
Okay. Well, first of all, Christian Zionism generally is it's growing in some parts of the world. In other parts of the world, it is diminishing. It is certainly growing in Africa, or let's put it this way. The biblicist or fundamentalist kind of Christian theology, it is on the rise in Africa, but it doesn't strongly, it hasn't made the connections in the same way that I just recently read an article about the Latin American evangelical churches. They don't make an automatic connection between their theology and Christian Zionism. And I do think that the Christian right wing inside the United States, the more Christian Zionists, that they are on the wane given the bad rap that Trump is increasingly getting, and that they've aligned themselves to Trump. So they're a bit kind of on the receding inside. Inside the churches itself, I think that the churches are struggling to find their feet. Liberation theology is trying to find their feet. As you know, many of the churches are funded by either, well, I'm not sure about the system in Austria, but in German, the churches are also funded by taxes and so on. And as the secularization of society increases, the churches are finding that they are less and less able to access finances. So church structures that are pro-solidarity, and in many ways, I mean, we are very grateful that the World Council of Churches and the World Council of Reformed Churches, that these are all entities that have remained true to their prophetic role, and that they've stuck, on the good side of history, particularly in relation more pertinently now to the Palestinians, but also on other things such as the integrity of creation, environmental justice, on gender issues, on a whole range of issues. The churches have remained largely prophetic. But the prophetic voices in the churches are sometimes the voices really of minorities. The voice gets amplified. It's like Desmond Tutu and Ellen Bussack and Beir Snodi. The church sends these people to the front. But internally, the church remains deeply conservative. Like if the church was really prophetic, we could have gotten a church venue for a meeting like this. If the church was really prophetic, it would have been your first. And so my call to the, and I know that, I suspect that Austria is a very Catholic country, am I right? Yes. Oh, okay, fine. Yes, so I know I'm on walking on troubled, on difficult grounds here. But my call to the World Council of Reformed Churches would be, how do you rediscover the notion of being a protesting church? How do you become a protesting church again? The question is often asked of Muslims, why are you so problematic? Why are Muslims so awkward? You're just difficult, you're just awkward. My question is, in a world of so much injustice, of so much greed, what's wrong with the church that it isn't problematic? Why isn't the church creating more of a headache for power? Why are the Muslims the only one giving headaches? So I don't appeal to Muslims to be less of a headache to the world. I'm perfectly happy with Muslims providing the world with headaches. I think the methods that they do to provide the world with headaches, it's ugly. I walk away from the methods with which they do it. But prophetic religion is essentially about providing a headache to those in power. اذهب إلى فرعون إنه طغى. Go to Pharaoh. He is an oppressor. So I don't know of a single religious figure. I don't know of a single prophet of God who ever came into this world and said, my major mission is to fit in with power. My battle is going to be to get a seat at the table of the powerful. Hey, this is an abomination. Inna hada la dhulmun azim. This is an abomination. Prophets don't do things like this. So once society is comfortable with the church must ask, oh my God, what's wrong with us? Once the government is happy with the church must ask, where have we gone wrong? This is the responsibility of the church. And this is what I will be telling them at the World Conference of Reformed Churches.
I'm Willy, but not Willy Brandt, because I'm an anti-imperialist. My question to you is about what is your idea on the solution of one democratic state or one common democratic state in Palestine? Because in South Africa it was the solution, and it could also help to dismantle the Zionist narrative in many ways.
Okay. I'll try to be brief, and I do want to say that my position is not an official BDS position. The official BDS position is that this is a question that must be left to the Palestinians. This is the official BDS position, that the Palestinians and the people who live there, not all the people who've come in from all over the world at the moment, but the people who live there, and that includes Jews and Israel and Muslims and Christians and atheists, that they must determine the nature of the future. I can't see for myself how, in the case of South Africa, the separation from people from other people on the basis of their ethnic backgrounds was the problem. And how, in the case of Israel, this is presented as the solution. I can't see how, if you believe that human beings are irredeemable, that human beings can never be saved, that human beings can never be transformed, it is then that you build borders that cannot be penetrated. And then you say this other group, they will always hate. People learn to hate. And people learn to love. And so for me to believe in the idea of a state founded for a particular ethnic group, that is a state that must militate against democracy. That is a state that must lead to the driving out of that large non-Jewish minority in that state. And it must lead to ethnic cleansing. I don't support ethnic cleansing. I do support a society based on human rights, on freedom for all, on respect for everybody's religion, support for religious lives and communities, and the non-interference of the state in people's personal convictions. That is the kind of society that I ideally envisage for my own, and that I think has worked pretty well in South Africa. South Africa also freed the whites of South Africa from their own anxieties and their own constrictions and being oppressed by their fears. And so in a similar way, I think that a non-racial Palestine will also free the Palestinians and the Jews. Thank you very much.
I think this was a very, very great final word. I think we should come to an end. Just let me say just some words about the BDS invites all interested participants to the open evening on Monday, the 3rd of July in the Center for Intercultural Initiatives in Gleisstrasse 8 in the 3rd District at 6:30 p.m. So we can discuss how to get involved in BDS, the principles of BDS. I want to say thank you, of course, to Leo Gabriel and of course to Farid Esack for this really, really interesting lecture and discussion. I want to ask you to support us also financially, because we no activists receive any money for their activism. But of course, activism costs money for hosting and organizing an event such this like this. And last but not least, what I wanted to say. Okay. Yeah.
I have a last one from my side. I want to thank everybody for coming. It was a lovely audience, and I also was energized by the audience.
Yeah. Marco will show me that I should also say thank you to the Austrian Arab Community Center, but I did it in the introduction, but thank you for reminding me. Thank you to the Austrian Arab Community Center and the Society of Austrian Arab Relationships. And of course, thank you to all the people who are attending this lecture, to Farid Esack, to Leo Gabriel, to all the helpers, to Richard for the translation, the camera, all the work to make this lecture be possible. So thank you so much. And normally, just one word. Normally, I would say we can discuss it in an informal way, but
moderators always say you can continue the discussion with the speaker in an informal way now. It's their way of kind of getting rid of the meeting and so on. But what they do in the process, they actually increase the headache for the speaker. So a personal request from this speaker is generally very, very tired after a presentation. And the last thing that the speaker wants is another question that I didn't get to ask you. I wanted to ask you, but I didn't get to ask you. So people, you know, in religious people always have these certainties. Embrace your own uncertainties. Enjoy your questions. Enjoy your questions. Live with your questions. Ask them of the next speaker who come, okay? So thank you very much. Thank you very much. I enjoyed your comments very much.
I wonder if the theology of
Yes. But Islamic liberation theology is also an option. Probably Latin American liberation theology.
Yes, I mean, some organizations are also looking for some
well, I have a number of people who have written about this, and I've written books on the Islamic liberation theology. But in the meantime, I don't have a card with me now, but I'm sure you guys 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 with me now, but I'm sure